The Gulf of Oman is where the Persian Gulf ends and the Arabian Sea begins, and it is where the ships that carry the Gulf's petroleum through the Strait of Hormuz make their first open water course change after the compression of the transit. It is also, for that reason, where a vessel that has been mined in the strait might not know it has been mined until the hull is already open to the sea. At 5:44 a.m., the MV Nordic Hawk, a 110,000 deadweight ton crude oil tanker on a southbound transit from Ras Tanura to Rotterdam, reported an explosion on its portside hull at frame 71, approximately 15 meters below the waterline, in the forward cargo tank section. The duty officer at the United States 5th Fleet Maritime Operations Center in Bahrain received the Mayday at 5:44 a.m. and 31 seconds. The tanker's master reported a single detonation, controlled flooding in cargo tank 3 port, no fire, crew mustering at emergency stations, ship maintaining steerage at reduced speed. A single detonation below the waterline in a cargo tank section. No fire. The ship still moving. The combination of those 3 facts was not consistent with an accidental mechanical failure or an engineering casualty. Accidental detonations aboard loaded crude tankers produced fire. Engineering casualties did not produce controlled, localized flooding at frame 71 without associated system failures across adjacent sections. The damage profile the master was describing was consistent with one specific cause: a contact or influence mine attached to the hull, detonating against the underwater hull plating at the specific frame depth and position that maximized hull penetration while minimizing the secondary ignition risk from the cargo immediately above. A magnetic mine. The assessment was made in the Maritime Operations Center at 5:45 a.m., 11 seconds after the Mayday was received, by a watch officer whose pre-shift briefing had included an intelligence advisory noting elevated Iranian mining activity indicators in the Strait of Hormuz and its approaches over the preceding 72 hours. Elevated indicators. 1 detonation report. The watch officer transmitted a flash alert to 5th Fleet Command and to the USS Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating 41 nautical miles northwest of the Nordic Hawk's reported position at 5:45 a.m. and 22 seconds. The destroyer was underway at 17 knots on a transit heading when the flash arrived. The commanding officer had been in the Combat Direction Center for 40 minutes. He had come early after the intelligence advisory the previous evening had produced the specific, low-frequency unease that 30 years in naval operations had taught him to respect. He read the flash assessment, noted the damage description, noted the 41 nautical mile distance, and made his first decision before the report had finished scrolling on his display. The destroyer would proceed to the Nordic Hawk at best speed, and the EOD team would be briefed and kitted before the ship was in helicopter range. The Explosive Ordnance Disposal Detachment embarked aboard the destroyer for this deployment was a 6-person team, 2 senior EOD technicians and 4 junior technicians, specialists in maritime mine neutralization, underwater ordnance disposal, and the specific compressed operational decision-making that EOD work in contested environments required. The senior technician had received the intelligence advisory the previous evening, along with the rest of the ship's department heads, and had spent 20 minutes afterward reviewing the technical file on Iranian mine types currently assessed as in the operational inventory. The review had been precautionary. At 5:47 a.m., it became operationally relevant. The EOD senior technician was in the Combat Direction Center at 5:49 a.m., having covered the distance from his berthing compartment with the focused movement of someone whose body had processed the urgency before his mind had fully articulated it. The commanding officer briefed him in 40 seconds. Probable magnetic mine, port hull, frame 71, below the waterline, single detonation, ship flooding but controlled. The technician asked 2 questions in succession. What is the ship's cargo, and what is the estimated hull penetration geometry from the reported flooding rate? Crude oil cargo. The flooding rate suggested a hull penetration of approximately 0.4 square meters, consistent with the fragment damage pattern of a limpet mine with a shaped charge warhead rather than the broader penetration of a free-floating influence mine. A limpet mine. Placed on the hull by swimmers or a submersible vehicle, designed to be attached manually at a specific location. Not a random maritime hazard drifting on the current. A deliberate placed weapon on a specific vessel at a specific frame. And if there was one, there might be more. He, the EOD senior technician, requested the helicopter and 2 divers at 5:50 a.m. The commanding officer authorized the tasking immediately and directed the MH-60S to begin pre-flight. The destroyer was at 34 nautical miles and closing at its maximum sustained speed of 30 knots. Estimated time of arrival, 68 minutes. The helicopter would reach the Nordic Hawk in approximately 22 minutes, providing the EOD team an operational window of 46 minutes before the ship arrived to support the dive operation with its own boats and equipment. 22 minutes of helicopter flight time. The EOD senior technician used 11 of those minutes to brief his 2 divers and complete their equipment preparation with the disciplined compression of a professional who had learned that the time available before an operation was the only time that existed for preparation, and that using it poorly was a choice rather than a constraint. At 6:16 a.m., the MH-60S arrived over the Nordic Hawk. The tanker was making approximately 4 knots, reduced from its transit speed by the flooding's effect on trim and the master's decision to slow down to reduce hull stress on the damaged frame section. It was listing approximately 3 degrees to port, the flooded cargo tank creating a measurable asymmetric weight distribution that was within the vessel's stability margins but would worsen if flooding progressed. The vessel was not in immediate danger of stability loss. It was in immediate danger if additional mine detonations occurred. The MH-60S pilot established a hover over the Nordic Hawk's port side at 60 feet, the rotor wash creating a controlled disturbance on the water surface below that the EOD divers would need to account for in their descent geometry. The senior technician made the descent first, entering the water at 6:17 a.m. and 20 seconds with his rebreather configured for the extended bottom time the hull inspection would require, and his mine identification equipment secured in the waterproof kit attached to his descent line. The water visibility in the Gulf of Oman at 06:17 hours in late autumn was approximately 8 meters, adequate for a hull inspection at frame 71 if the inspection was systematic and the diver's light was positioned correctly relative to the hull surface. The senior technician reached frame 71 at 6:17 a.m. and 51 seconds and began his inspection of the hull plating in the area of the reported detonation. The damage at frame 71 was consistent with the analytical prediction. A roughly circular penetration approximately 65 centimeters in diameter, surrounded by a star-shaped deformation of the hull plating, consistent with a shaped charge detonation from the exterior surface inward. Limpet mine. The detonation had removed the mine itself. Shaped charge detonations on hull surfaces typically destroyed the device in the process of breaching the hull. No mine hardware remaining at the detonation site. The senior technician did not stop at frame 71. He continued his inspection forward along the port hull, working systematically toward the bow in 3-meter increments, his light sweeping the hull surface at close range. At frame 64, he found the second mine. It was attached to the hull at the lower turn of the bilge keel at a depth of approximately 12 meters. A disc-shaped device, approximately 40 centimeters in diameter and 8 centimeters thick, with 4 magnetic attachment pads visible on its face and a small cylindrical housing on its upper edge that the senior technician identified, from the technical file he had reviewed the previous evening, as consistent with an influence fuse housing. A detonation system triggered by the magnetic signature of the ship's hull rather than requiring direct physical contact activation. The second mine was armed and intact. He transmitted to the helicopter via his underwater communication system at 6:19 a.m. and 44 seconds. His transmission was 3 words: second mine. Frame 64. The transmission was received in the MH-60S and immediately relayed to the destroyer and to the Maritime Operations Center. The MH-60S was hovering at 60 feet. The EOD senior technician was 12 meters below the surface at the hull of a crude oil tanker with an intact influence mine 12 feet from his face. His second diver was descending behind him. The destroyer was 51 minutes away. The situation had developed faster than the timeline had predicted it would. The senior technician's operational decision at 6:20 a.m. was made with the specific quality of judgment that EOD training produces. Not fast, not slow, but precisely calibrated to the available information and the acceptable risk parameters of the specific device and the specific environment. An influence mine at frame 64, forward of the first detonation at frame 71, on a loaded crude oil tanker with 110,000 deadweight tons of crude in adjacent tanks. The detonation of the mine at frame 64 would create a second penetration forward of the first, potentially compromising the structural integrity of the longitudinal bulkhead between tanks 3 and 4 and accelerating the flooding beyond the vessel's stability envelope. The mine needed to be neutralized before the tanker could be safely boarded by damage control personnel, or before additional movement created hull flexure that might shift the mine's position relative to its magnetic field sensor calibration. He requested the neutralization kit from the second diver at 6:20 a.m. The kit contained the specific equipment for limpet mine neutralization that the EOD team had briefed and packed before the helicopter launch, a disruption charge designed to defeat the mine's fuse mechanism without detonating the main charge, attachment hardware for securing the disruption charge to the mine body, and the firing circuit that would allow the charge to be initiated from a safe distance after both divers had cleared the hull area. At 6:21 a.m. and 14 seconds, a fast boat appeared. It came from the northeast, from a bearing consistent with the Iranian coast 38 nautical miles away, at a speed the MH-60S pilot estimated at 40 knots. It was running without navigation lights. The MH-60S radar operator had it at 4 nautical miles when the pilot first saw it visually in the early morning light, which meant it had been in the radar picture for at least 90 seconds before the pilot's visual acquisition. 90 seconds during which the radar system had been prioritizing the water surface around the Nordic Hawk's hull rather than the approaches. The fast boat was not heading for the Nordic Hawk. It was heading for the helicopter's hover position. The MH-60S pilot transmitted the contact to the destroyer at 6:21 a.m. and 22 seconds and simultaneously broadcast on Channel 16 directing the approaching vessel to identify itself and alter course. No response. The boat maintained its speed and bearing. At 6:21 a.m. and 41 seconds, the fast boat opened fire. The weapon was a heavy machine gun mounted on the boat's bow, visible to the MH-60S crew as a muzzle flash and a tracer line at approximately 3 nautical miles that passed below and aft of the helicopter's position by perhaps 40 meters. Not accurate, but not a warning shot aimed at the water in front of the helicopter. A shot aimed at the helicopter from 3 miles that missed by 40 meters. The MH-60S pilot broke the hover immediately, climbing and turning south, transmitting simultaneously to the EOD technicians underwater and to the destroyer. The 2 EOD divers were still at the hull, 12 meters below the surface, unable to receive the pilot's radio transmission in real time, aware only that the sound profile above them had changed from the steady rhythmic thump of a hovering helicopter to something that was diminishing rapidly. The second diver had a hydrophone communications link to the surface. The MH-60S crew transmitted the contact warning through the hydrophone link at 6:22 a.m. and 3 seconds. EOD, surface. Fast boat contact from northeast. Weapons fire. We are breaking hover. Do not ascend on current bearing. The senior technician received the transmission at 6:22 a.m. and 9 seconds. He was 6 seconds from completing the disruption charge attachment to the mine body. He completed the attachment. The decision to complete the attachment rather than immediately begin his ascent was the specific kind of decision that EOD operators make and that exists nowhere in any training document's decision tree because it cannot be put in a decision tree. It is a judgment about the relative weight of an incomplete neutralization on a loaded tanker versus the risk profile of 6 additional seconds at depth while a fast boat was engaging the helicopter support asset above. He completed the attachment because the mine was the larger threat in the larger picture, and because 6 seconds was 6 seconds. He and his diver began their ascent at 6:22 a.m. and 15 seconds. The MH-60S was at 400 feet and 1 nautical mile south of the Nordic Hawk when the fast boat reached the tanker's port side. The boat did not stop at the tanker. It circled the tanker's bow at high speed, firing a second burst that was aimed at the MH-60S's new position and fell short by a greater margin than the first. The helicopter's altitude gain and lateral displacement had opened the engagement geometry beyond the boat crew's accuracy threshold. The MH-60S pilot was not a combat helicopter pilot in the conventional sense. The MH-60S was a logistics and support platform, not a gunship, and its crew's weapons consisted of a pintle-mounted M240 machine gun operated by the crew chief that was present as a self-defense measure rather than as an offensive weapons system. The rules of engagement authorized defensive fire against a vessel that had initiated hostile action. The fast boat had fired twice. The rules of engagement were clear. The crew chief fired the M240 at 6:22 a.m. and 44 seconds. The burst was directed at the fast boat's bow section, which was the area of the vessel presenting the largest target aspect from the MH-60S's position. The range was 1.4 nautical miles, at the outer edge of the M240's effective accuracy range from a moving helicopter platform in the specific, difficult geometry of a low, fast surface target observed from a medium-altitude aircraft at oblique angle. The first burst fell short. The second burst, fired after the pilot adjusted the helicopter's position to reduce the oblique angle, struck the fast boat's forward section, producing visible damage to the bow structure and causing a rapid reduction in the vessel's speed as the crew lost the control of their speed and direction. The boat slewed to port, its speed dropping from 40 knots to approximately 8 knots in under 15 seconds. It did not stop. It turned northeast, away from the Nordic Hawk, and accelerated slowly on its remaining propulsion. At 6:23 a.m. and 12 seconds, the 2 EOD divers surfaced on the Nordic Hawk's port side. They had been underwater for 6 minutes and 19 seconds. They had attached a neutralization charge to an intact influence mine on the hull of a loaded crude oil tanker while a fast boat was conducting a weapons attack on their support helicopter. They surfaced, confirmed each other's status, and transmitted to the MH-60S on their surface communications. Both divers up. Mine charge is set. Ready for firing circuit connection on your availability. The MH-60S pilot acknowledged at 6:23 a.m. and 21 seconds and confirmed the fast boat was withdrawing on a northeasterly heading at approximately 12 knots, still moving but no longer approaching. He descended back toward the Nordic Hawk to provide the divers with the firing circuit connection equipment from the mission kit. The neutralization charge fired at 6:27 a.m. and 14 seconds. Both divers were clear of the hull by 120 meters, the minimum safe separation for the charge size, when the firing circuit was activated from the MH-60S. The disruption charge detonation was a sharp, controlled event that the crew of the Nordic Hawk felt as a brief vibration through the hull and heard as a flat crack underwater, distinctly different from the heavier impact of the first mine's main charge detonation 43 minutes earlier. No secondary explosion. No hull penetration. The mine's fuse mechanism had been disrupted, and the main charge had not been initiated. The second mine was neutralized. The destroyer arrived at 7:08 a.m. By that time, the EOD team had been recovered to the Nordic Hawk's deck. The MH-60S was maintaining a surveillance orbit at 800 feet, and the tanker's damage control team had established controlled flooding management in Cargo Tank 3 port that was maintaining the flooding level without further progression. The hull penetration from the first mine was confirmed at 0.42 square meters, within the range the flooding rate analysis had suggested. The ship was stable. It was not making further way. It was waiting. The destroyer's arrival brought its own EOD capability, its boarding team, and its medical resources. The boarding team completed a full underwater hull survey between 7:15 a.m. and 8:44 a.m., working from the destroyer's rigid hull inflatable boats with the EOD team's underwater inspection equipment. The survey found no additional mine devices. 2 mines had been placed on the Nordic Hawk's hull. 1 had detonated. 1 had been neutralized. The fast boat was tracked by the MH-60S radar until it crossed into Iranian territorial waters at 6:58 a.m., at which point its radar return merged with the coastal clutter and was lost. The tracking data was transmitted to Fifth Fleet and to the intelligence community simultaneously. A vessel with visible damage to its forward section, crossing into Iranian territorial waters from a bearing and timing consistent with an attack on a USS-supported tanker EOD operation, was the specific kind of intelligence product that generated task priorities in multiple analytical queues simultaneously. The after-action assessment was completed in Bahrain at 2 p.m. Its findings confirmed the analytical assessment that had been made in 11 seconds at 5:45 a.m. The detonation aboard the Nordic Hawk had been caused by a limpet mine placed on the hull, consistent with Iranian maritime sabotage doctrine. The presence of a second intact mine at frame 64 was consistent with a 2-mine placement operation, a doctrine observed in previous Iranian maritime mining operations in which mines were placed in pairs to increase the probability of achieving a disabling hull penetration, even if one mine's placement or detonation timing was suboptimal. The fast boat's involvement was assessed as a deliberate element of the operation's security architecture, a reaction force positioned to prevent or disrupt mine neutralization operations if the vessel's mining was detected and a response was dispatched. The timing of the fast boat's approach, arriving at the Nordic Hawk's position approximately 35 minutes after the first detonation, was consistent with a crew that had been monitoring the emergency frequency traffic and had identified the MH-60S's approach as a mine neutralization response rather than a standard rescue helicopter. They had come to prevent the neutralization. They had come 18 seconds too late. The EOD senior technician completed his portion of the after-action report at 4:30 p.m. He documented the timeline, the device characteristics, the neutralization sequence, and the fast boat engagement with the precision that the EOD community's reporting standards required. The final entry in his technical section was the 6-second interval, the time between the communications warning about the fast boat and the completion of the disruption charge attachment. He did not annotate that entry. He left it as a number in a timeline. Numbers in timelines are the record. They do not explain the decisions that filled them. They do not need to. The decisions speak in their outcomes. 1 mine detonated, 1 mine neutralized, 2 divers surfaced, 0 personnel lost, 1 tanker stable in the water at 7:08 a.m. with the destroyer alongside. The Gulf of Oman was running its standard morning swell when the destroyer took up its escort position. The tanker would make port under escort. Its hull would be repaired. Its cargo would be delivered. The route through which it had come would be sailed again by the next ship and the ship after that, in the specific, persistent movement of a maritime economy that does not stop because the approaches to the strait contain mines. It does not stop because the people who clear the path go back into the water when the situation requires it, with 6 seconds remaining and a mine that needs to be neutralized and a decision to make about the 6 seconds. They made the right one. The route was open in the morning. It always is, because they always make it.